My name's Jack Chapman, and I'm the VP of Threat Intelligence for Egress. And it's really mine and my team's job to really understand how organizations are being attacked, especially in sort of the email space, and very focused on sort of the evolution advancements in phishing attacks. Because although we use a lot of the same language around sort of phishing emails, spear phishing, and whaling, the attacks are evolving at quite some pace. So today I've highlighted sort of 3 phishing emails which cover a broad range of vectors, and sort of just to take you through what myself and my team sort of perceive from them and the direction of travel of some of these attacks. One thing to note before we dive in is this session's being recorded and we'll share it with you after the event. Just the other thing from an admin side is we do have a Q&A at the end of this session, so please submit any and all questions, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you have there. And any we don't have a chance to answer in this specific session, we'll follow up afterwards with yourselves. Now, to start with, I'd like to take you through sort of what we often call a sort of 24-hour news cycle attack. This is definitely something we're seeing more and more. This specific example is impersonating Tesco. But this is all off the bat of the sort of so-called living crisis we're facing in the UK at the moment and in other areas around the world. The interesting thing and the challenge with a lot of these attacks is within 24 hours of a news article appearing on sort of on the TV or the radio, an attacker's already created a template and is sending out these attacks. The challenges with this is the fact that it's very much on people's minds. They're often quite emotive topics, and it's often in areas that traditional sort of software awareness training or phishing training haven't covered because they are so new. And as you can see here, and we'll dig into more specific elements in a moment, it's pixel perfect. And this is what we're seeing in a lot of phishing attacks at the moment. The sort of old advice of looking at sort of logos or poor grammar, or does that image look too stretched, are kind of fading in relevance because the attacks we're seeing nowadays are of a much more professional standard. But I know it can be quite hard to sort of see when sharing screen, so I've just zoomed in a little bit for you so we can go through this specific example in particular. So to begin with, in this subject, we've got a very strong emotive element of win £200 Tesco voucher. From a human sort of behavioural science point of view, it's definitely playing on that greed element. It follows up with a very similar pattern in the alias name coming from Tesco Club Cards Rewards. So there's no doubt here that they are very strongly impersonating Tesco all throughout, including the Tesco image and the logo, and even going down to actually the sign-off of the email where they've copied and pasted it from a legitimate Tesco email, where they even have the company name and the registered office. Part of the reason that criminals are doing this in such a way is because it builds credibility, especially for these sort of broader attacks where they're often viewed as burner attacks, where they sort of one-offs. They need to build credibility instantly, and this is how it's achieved. So already in this email, we've got the fact that you've got a greed hook of why would a user click on this email? Because they might be able to win some money. You've got the fact that at a glance, it looks very credible. But to go forward from there, what is the ask of this email? This is the delivery mechanism of something nasty into an organization. What are they trying to achieve? And here it's quite clear. They want you to click a link to register. And what this actually does is it takes you through to another sort of HTML page, which scrapes Office 365 credentials. And we're seeing around sort of 92–93% of phishing attacks at the moment being credential harvesting. It's definitely become the #1 asset in criminal ecosystems in order to sort of purchase and sell. As with Office 365, if you've got one set of credentials, you've almost got the keys to the kingdom. So that, in relation to a lot of criminal ecosystems, that's their intent. A lot of the interesting elements here is that this particular attack managed to bypass Microsoft and other secure email gateways. And part of the reason for this is actually came from a compromised account to begin with, where DMARC was passing. It appeared to have a legitimate background and history. And a lot of the language and the other links within this email legitimately point towards Tesco. There's only actually one malicious link here compared to 8 benign links. And that's often done to try and target security systems in and of themselves, which is sort of a recurring theme. If we look more at the link itself, we're quite often sort of trained, and we train our users to hover over the link. This is going to Tesco Surprises and misspelt.com. So from a user's point of view, they've hovered over, they've seen Tesco reinforced within the link itself. I know a lot of the training says if it's not going to the direct site, we shouldn't do that. But a lot of the purpose for this email is to keep users in that type 1 thinking. By exploiting their emotion, you're trying to keep them in that fast, fluid thinking, rather than the type 2 thinking, which is often around, let's slow down, let's use our training, let's be very cognizant here. Overall, we've seen this type of attack have quite a large amount of success. And the challenge with these attacks is, this is just one specific example. We've seen it related to energy companies, different food stores, different essentially core parts of life like council tax, water bills, and so on. It's all playing off the sort of current geopolitical ecosystem. And it shows no signs of going forward. And for me, the key thing we need to be cognizant on from a defensive point of view is how can we make our users aware these attacks occur? The fact that if something is in the news, you're far more likely to receive an attack around that subject, because it's incredibly difficult to train on each instance that this occurs, because unfortunately the news moves on very quickly. For the sort of second type of attack I'd like to take you through, is a far more technical based attack. And this is one of the areas we're seeing a lot of from a crime as a service point of view. And what I mean by that is from where criminals are creating more sophisticated technology to either automate phishing attacks or to automatically make pre-existing phishing attacks more effective, and they can sell these kits on to other criminals. And one of the sort of big areas of innovation is around obfuscation. And here we've got an example of your traditional DHL phishing attack, one of the most sort of impersonated brands in the world at the moment. And it's telling the traditional story, the fact that they're not going to be able to achieve their scheduled delivery date. Please have a look at this tiny picture, which a user is instinctively going to want to click on to make it bigger. Once again, it's another sort of credential scraping payload, as is all too common nowadays. And but there's something going on behind the scenes here. And if you highlighted the email, and especially if you copy and paste it into any other sort of word processor, you'll be able to see that the attacker has managed to hide a lot of content in order to break up the email. There's quite a broad range of techniques we've seen happen over the last sort of couple of years in this space. Everything from using zero-size text and white text on white backgrounds, and similar ways to essentially break the email from a security point of view. That would break any traditional regular expression scanning or keyword scanning. And the thing that's really changed with this, however, is the automation of it. Before, this was sort of more of an abnormal element. It took an attacker a manual process to obfuscate. Now there's pre-existing toolkits out there where if you just injected a .eml file, so just put in an email file, it will automatically go in and obfuscate it for the attacker. The other output of this, depending on what technique is used, is very good for mobile phones, as mobile phones process emails in a very different way to computers at times. As such, we're seeing a lot of attacks focused on targeting users on their mobile use these techniques more. And that can kind of relate to the time of day, trying to time it so a user might be out of office or at lunch and so on to use some of these techniques. But these are becoming more prevalent and more challenging at times, and understanding how attackers are utilizing these new techniques enables us to sort of understand how and why. Because my expectation is, how could a user see some of these techniques? One example here is hover over and a selection would sort of showcase what's going on behind the scenes. There are some where you have to copy and paste it, increase the font size, change the color, and all these additional steps which are adding friction to users, which is very challenging. So there's something to be aware of, the fact that there are these new attacks going on. We still call them phishing. There aren't special names for it, but the sort of threat landscape is evolving to what works. And especially a lot of these attacks are targeting a lot of sort of the traditional security ecosystems, sort of SEGs and Microsoft. Because at the end of the day, if a phisher can't get past those systems, they're not going to be very successful in their criminal field. The third part, again, quite a technical attack I'd like to talk you through, is what we call time of click attacks, or DNS attacks. Traditionally in the email space, we sort of consider, if we've scanned an email and it's been proven safe before it's got into the user's inbox, that email is then safe forever. There's no further concern. However, this is the attack that actually changes the link payload after a set duration of time. So one thing to note, this attack we've seen be applied to almost all phishing attacks, everything from very targeted spear phishing attacks all the way through to the bulk send, your mailbox is full, impersonate Microsoft, and so on. So the situation here is an attacker will send this email out at 6 or 7 a.m. It will come in, it will be scanned, and we see that the link redirects to a Microsoft page. However, at 9 a.m., through changing where that redirect points to, it will then be changed to redirect towards a malicious credential scraping site. So it's like a dynamic payload. The challenge here is it's already in the user's inbox. It's already happened. What makes this more complicated on top of that is that quite often attackers are utilizing essentially one-time click payloads, so that when a user opens it and interacts with it, it'll take them through to the malicious site. Immediately after, so it will redirect to the benign site. So regardless of sort of the detection side, even from a post-breach analysis, trying to remediate and understand what's happening here, attackers are making our lives harder. And the effectiveness of this, if a user reports the fact that, oh, I think I've made a mistake, could you have a look? And sort of someone in the IT and security teams goes away and sees the fact it redirects to Microsoft, it's very easy for an admin to make a mistake there. And the reason attackers are doing this is it's a lot easier to get for a phishing attack to land in a user's inbox if it is benign on send, and the fact they can weaponize it to whatever they choose. So if they're doing a bulk campaign using this method, it allows them to see the fact that actually it's starting to be blocked through certain services, and they can just choose a backup payload for those who haven't interacted with the email yet. And this sort of changes sometimes how we think about security, especially in the email space where it's always been boundary first. In the fact that if attackers are looking at more ways of interacting in the emails, everything from using tracking pixels, dynamic payloads, attachments with multiple redirects within them, it's important that we sort of have policy, technology, and training in place to make people understand the why, and the fact we've got those robust controls and security to mitigate these more advanced attacks. Once again, this would fall under that broader bucket of phishing, which is where it's important for practitioners to always dig down to that next level, which is often a challenge. And the last thing I'd like to point out for this sort of attack is the fact this is once again being templated by attackers and selling it on as toolkits. So an attacker could essentially go online. This is a non-sophisticated attacker. They would go online and actually purchase this and use it rather than having to create their own payload. And this is an ongoing theme we're seeing throughout all attacks that we're seeing, is it's not just the matter that attacks are on average becoming more sophisticated, it's the fact they're becoming more available. And that's why we're seeing more attacks getting through. So those are three sort of very different sort of techniques and attack vectors. I just sort of like to give you sort of three key takeaways that go along with this. With how sort of fast moving the world is, we need to be aware that attackers are keeping pace with that because they're earning more money and having greater success in their attacks if they do so. So we need to be aware that with how quick the world is going, we need to quickly evaluate our security and policy and training in place appropriate for those attacks, and how can we sort of mitigate on a broader field and not rely on a sort of one-to-one relation. Secondly is very much understanding how this changing criminal ecosystem is having an impact in the attack landscape. I know when we talk about crime as a service and other elements like hacking forums, the darknet and so on, it's not a new thing, but it is definitely evolving into a more worrying and successful element. And lastly, security in depth is key. We often talk about security as sort of layers of an onion. However, there's a reason for that. As attackers are starting to sort of target multiple pillars of security, like they're targeting both human element and the policy element and the technology element, it's important that our layers work together on that, and that we do have as many barriers as possible to mitigate these sorts of threats. Feel free to keep sending your question. I'll sort of go on to some of the sort of questions we've had coming through. So one of the questions I've got is, how do you sort of augment training to incorporate these phishing emails which leverage the 24-hour news cycle? It's a really good question. I think quite a difficult answer, to be honest, because I don't think there's a way you can directly mitigate it unless you want to fall back on doing daily training, which is incredibly time consuming. So I think you need to sort of train for the broader appeal and then ensure the technology and policy supports that, because it's the unfortunate truth that regardless of how much training you give someone, there are certain attacks which either that user's not a sophisticated cyber expert or they've been caught out. That is, they're not going to be able to catch. So for me, training is there as a foundation, something that can augment and support and raise that bar across the whole organization. But it's understanding where we can best sort of put those resources to augment and support them on top of their training. Another question of, are there any other post-delivery attacks that we should be aware of? The main one is very much that DNS-based attack at the moment, of that time of click attack, in both links but also attachments as well. We're seeing a lot of attackers put their attacks into attachments to try and obfuscate and hide it from traditional sort of malware and link-based scanners. However, I have no doubt that as soon as that method becomes less effective, they'll pivot to something else. And I know they're using things like pixel tracking in order to perform scouting attacks to find when a user opens an email. I could see there being some evolutions on that. Are there sites/companies that track topical attacks such as DHL and Tesco that can be checked to see what's recent? Not in the traditional sense of that focused, especially in the phishing ecosystem. Quite often you've got sort of some of the traditional threat intelligence feeds that will cover where attackers are looking at it, but quite often it's quite fragmented just in the nature of how fast these attacks happen. I know quite often I'll wake up in the morning and look on BBC News, and that's quite often I'll be like, okay, we're going to have this type of attack today, because it is that fast. So unfortunately, there isn't a traditional resource for this. Have you seen any correlation between being in a data breach and the types of phishing emails received? In short, yes. I think the latest attribute number was around 70 to 80% of phish an organization receives are directly related to what data breaches a user's been in. Part of the reason for this, especially with that morphing crime as an ecosystem or crime as a service ecosystem, is that's essentially the starting point for their sort of scouting of any organization. So the more sort of public facing and the more information about a user in the wild, the more likely they are to receive an attack. Just another question around, if I have two-factor authentication, do I need to be worried about credential scraping attacks? This is a good question and sort of one that's quite topical at the moment, especially as all of the examples I've shown were around credential scraping attacks. So quite often we think of multi-factor or two-factor authentication as a bit of a silver bullet, because you're making sure that there's an extra step of validation that a user has to do to sign in. However, attackers have noticed this, and there's certain attacks like Evil Genix and quite a few others, sort of templated elements, where an attacker, as part of their payloads and their credential scraping, will actually ask the user for their multi-factor authentication. And then they will use OAuth services to actually validate the credentials that users offered to them before saving them. So they're only saving correct credentials. The other concern, especially for multi-factor authentication, is that human element. I think we saw in one of the latest attacks where an attacker sent 50 requests for multi-factor authentication to a user, and the user felt so bogged down in the end, they just said yes, which always shows we need to support our users in this. So even though it's fantastic, I encourage everyone to use it across all sign-in services, especially where applicable. It's not a silver bullet though. If it's caused enough frustration for attackers that they are starting to find ways around it. Do spear phishing or whaling attacks or those targeting admins have a high efficiency or efficacy? Are there any cohorts of employees or users that need to be focused on more heightened training and awareness? I think it's a really good question, and I think it focuses on who do we need to protect the most? Do we need to offer more training or policy controls to certain employees rather than others? I think it boils down to risk at the end of the day. There's two types of risk to consider in this space. Those of when that risk turns into a threat, what impact would that have on the organization? For example, the financial controllers, those who hold the keys to the kingdom in terms of IT access. But then on the other side, it's those users who are attacked far more frequently, who have been in more breaches, who are being targeted more on that side because they are more visible. I think in both cases, it's important to have more training and policy in place to support those users. I remember one case, a individual user from an organization of around 300 or 400 received 50% of that organization's phishing attacks just because of their public persona and the amount of breaches they'd been in. So I think definitely be more focused, but don't drop the bottom bar as well, as we've seen too many breaches occur because someone in an entry-level job or the summer intern was targeted as the way into the organization. So I think it's a balanced approach. One thing we hear quite a lot is quite often it's difficult initially to get visibility on who they should be focusing on here. So that's where I'd recommend sort of viewing it through the lens of the two camps. Who could cause the most damage if they were compromised, or the most disruption to the organization, but also who's being attacked the most in and of itself, and why is that? Because if you could start looking sort of left of the kill chain of why are people attacked, you can better sort of allocate the defenses in place. I think that's all we have time for today. I hope that was useful, and sort of just showcased a couple of different attacks, and really appreciated the question. We'll be sending out some follow-on communications in the next couple of days, and we'd love your feedback on this session. And just so we can make sure any future sessions we're offering here, showcasing different attacks or different elements of the threat landscape, can add the most value as possible. So thank you once again for attending. But if you do have any questions regarding today's session, please email us at customersuccess@egress.com. And thank you very much.